gather near. The doctor's in the house, so lend him your ear. The things he can say might even make your day. He might even help your pain go away. The doctor is in the house. The doctor is in the house. Let the doctor know what's bothering you. I'm sure he can tell you just what to do. The doctor is in the house. Doctor is in the house. Let the doctor know what's bothering you. The doctor is in the house. If you have a pain, call a doctor. If you have a sprain, call a doctor. Let the doctor know what you're going through. Let him tell you what's good for you, because the doctor is in the house. The doctor is in the house. Call a doctor. Call a doctor. Call a doctor. Call a doctor. Tell me what's happening now.
Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Ron, unfiltered, uncensored, with hosts Dr. Ron and Dr. Jerry, bringing you an extra program this week because we have some information from a Dr. Dalrymple, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. So with an attitude of gratitude, I want to welcome everybody, because we know that gratitude not only boasts joy and general life satisfaction, it is also the single best predictor of good relationships and benefits both sanity and physical health. Ladies and gentlemen, this program contains general medical information. The medical information heard on this program is not advice and should not be treated as such. The information is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should never delay seeking medical advice, disregard medical advice, or discontinue medical treatment because of information heard on this program. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained from this program with other sources and review all information regarding any medical condition or treatment with your physician. That being said, let's start the show by welcoming our co-host and contributor, Dr. Jerry Smith. Good afternoon, Dr. Jerry.
Thank you. It's a lovely day. The sun is out, and there's very few chemtrails, so it's a good day.
Excellent. And you know what, we're waiting for Dr. Dalrymple, who, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be contacting us from Great Britain. Just want to say that, you know, for the past years now, I've been telling you, you have to be the CEO of your own body. In other words, you have to have control and listen to your body also. And something was brought to my attention yesterday in Pennsylvania, Dr. Jerry. In Pennsylvania, there's a bill in Pennsylvania now that would allow physician assistants to open up their own offices without supervision.
That's
now,
good.
Physician assistants average 750 hours of training. Medical doctors average 4,000 hours of training. Now, there's no doubt, you know, we talk about the deficiencies, but you know, what would you rather have? A person that's been trained 750 hours to fly an airplane, or one that has 4,000 air miles? So people in Pennsylvania, you really have to watch and be educated about what's happening.
Well, as long as they have offices in Walmart, it'll be okay.
Well, you broke the code, and that's the plan. To
right.
do away with physicians and have them work for the insurance companies, Walmarts, Kmarts, what have you, and as
long as they have discount coupons for the surgery.
Isn't it crazy? I mean, it is just absolutely crazy where we're headed. Well, you know, I know you had two successes this week. I had one success. I had a call this morning from a dear friend and an avid listener of this program, that her PET scan is completely free of all cancer, and she's feeling great. She's feeling up. And people say, well, what was her success? Well, her success was a natural lifestyle with lots of herbs and so forth. And also, so when we had Dr. Ralph Moss on the program, she had consulted with him, and between the two of them, they had a very successful treatment of her esophageal cancer. Dr. Jerry, I see Dr. Dalrymple is on the board. I want to try and bring him in. Dr. Dalrymple, is that you, sir?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is, like I said, this is an extra podcast for us this week, and I do appreciate your trusting us and bringing you this extra podcast. This is something that came across my email about Dr. Theodore Dalrymple. He turned a critical eye on the New England Journal of Medicine for a full year, and during that year he found a list of dubious premises, outright mistakes, and dangerous cultural political correctness that he felt had to be said. And he has a new expose out titled False Positive, A Year of Error, Omission, Political Correctness in the New England Journal of Medicine. And before I introduce him, I want to read two things that we've talked about on this podcast during the last 5 years. The first one is from 1988. Dr. Dalrymple, you might appreciate this. This is from a Montreal anthropologist named Coco Butterworth. And he penned an article called IPPOTA, I-P-P-O-T-A, which stands for Inverted Pyramidal Proliferation of Theoretical Assumptions. And he says that this is far worse than any disease that has ever plagued the human race, the building or proliferation of ludicrous suppositions upon a pointed foundation that is both aesthetic and shaky. So not to go into this whole article because we want to hear from Dr. Dalrymple, but just reading the last paragraph of it, he says, when reading scientific articles, always be on the alert for the following words or phrases. Finding suggests, indicates, seems to suggest, theorizes, perhaps might mean, all evidence points to, we can assume, future study should verify, and so forth. So unfortunately, many theoretical assumptions have been built up, added to, and augmented, and then presented as scientific fact. So that's from 1988. And then from 2008, here we go with when we started analyzing modern medicine and the so-called scientific system. Well, there's a dark truth that's been hiding out there, ladies and gentlemen. We told you about this years ago. There are two editors of prestigious and respected medical journals in the world, and during their long careers, they have read and scrutinized more studies than any doctor, researcher, or bureaucrat, or any medical blogger. And this is what they have written. One, it is, quote, it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of, wait to hear this, the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Marcia Angell. She wrote that in 2009. And the second one, the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Not to go into that, but that was penned by Dr. Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of no less than The Lancet. So, Dr. Dalrymple, this is Dr. Ron, and we also have my co-host, Dr. Jerry, on the line. Your CV is astonishing. I don't know where to start. I imagine you also speak French. You were a prison doctor. You're a board-certified psychiatrist. You have written many articles, and you've penned a lot of material. So rather than me take up the time with this, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Well, I'm a retired doctor now. I've been retired for a number of years. And I've traveled fairly extensively in the world. I've written about a great number of things. And I had the idea of writing a book when my French nephew asked me for help in the French in the Paris Medical School. He's a medical student. They have an exam on how to read scientific papers and scientific journals, which is actually a very good idea. I don't know if other medical schools do that now. But anyway, it was a very good idea, and he asked for my help. And so I tried to give him a few rules of thumb. They're not absolute rules, but they're rules of thumb in how to be critical of papers, not necessarily cynical, or not with the idea of poo-pooing good things, but to read things with a critical eye. He passed the examination, but I don't know whether that was due to my assistance or not. It would be a scientific error to say that it was due to my.
You can take credit for it. Go ahead.
Anyhow, so then I thought, well, I'll look at the New England Journal, and of course, most doctors, when they read medical journals, for understandable reasons, they're very busy people, they tend to read the summary and conclusions and hope that the contents justifies the conclusions. And one of the problems with that is that they don't read the papers line by line. Only doctors specifically interested in that small particular subject read things line by line. And what I discovered is if you read things line by line, you often don't necessarily agree with the conclusions. And this was really the first, actually after my retirement, was the first time I realized that.
So you concentrated, as I understand it, mainly on the New England Journal. Is that true?
Yes, I just took one because I took the New England Journal. I suppose I could have taken the Lancet or some other journal, but I took the New England Journal because it's a very prestigious journal.
Exactly. Well, so you reviewed the content of the article and then tried to determine if the conclusions were viable and were based on fact. What are some of the reasons you think for this reporting, these false positives that are reported in these journals?
Well, I dare say some of it is just a mistake. There probably are no perfect studies that can't be questioned. Science isn't like that. In some cases, I think people are so attached to their theories that they will not so much bend the evidence as, torture the evidence, should I say, to make it accord with what they want. In one or two cases, I can't say for certain, but I suspected a degree of corruption. You quoted Marcia Angel. Of course, she was principally concerned with the pharmaceutical industry's influence on medical research, but I think there are other influences as well. And I suppose just sloppiness. There's also the desire for certain. I mean, you have a desired outcome, and so that's what you get.
Dr. Dalrymple, this is Dr. Smith.
Yes.
One of the issues that I came across that certainly I'm sure you have also noticed was conflict of interest. There was a psychiatry study with the association between exercise and mental health in the Lancet back in August 30th of 2018. And one of the authors basically had a financial interest in a company that was, promoting, I guess, health. Anyway, so they basically were selling the memberships or whatever to the organization. So I think conflict of interest is also a big reason for corruption.
Well, I think it probably is. It's, of course, very difficult to prove because you can't actually show that someone who has an interest is necessarily being dishonest. But in one or two cases, nowadays they have to declare their work for drug companies, and there were a few cases where I thought it would have been quicker for the people who wrote the paper to write a list of the companies they hadn't worked for. They'd worked for so many. And I suppose they hoped that people concluded that they all cancelled each other out. I'm not sure that is the case. There was a doctor, a psychiatrist, as it happens, in England, who was known as the universal prostitute, and he would go and extol at meetings a particular product, and the next weekend would be extolling a competitor product with the same kind of passion. So the fact that he worked for more than one company didn't mean that the interests cancelled each other out. So there is that. There's certainly that. Yes.
So, Dr. Dalrymple, we have had like Professor Peskin on our podcast, and he again reiterates the difference between absolute and relative risk, and how the two are intermingle. Could you explain what you understand by that to our audience?
Well, I was going to tell you that if you eat or refrain from eating a certain thing, and you have, as a result of your action or your inaction, a 1.2 times risk of contracting a disease. That's no use to you unless you know what your risk of contracting the disease is. And if, for example, you had a 3 times increased risk of something, but the initial risk was 1 in 3 million, then having a 3 times risk would mean that it was 1 in a million. But obviously, it is much more dramatic to say that you have a 3 times increased risk than if you have a 1 in a million risk. And this actually is a very important thing, because what I discovered was, in looking at papers in the New England Journal, many of the papers gave a relative risk without giving an absolute risk, and left it to the reader to work out for himself what the absolute risk was. And in almost all cases, the absolute risk was trivial, even if the relative risk was great. But in any case, many of the papers, especially the epidemiological papers, involved huge numbers of people. I mean, in one case, there were 60 million. And they worked out relative risks. And after immense statistical manipulations, which I, for one, am not qualified to talk about, and I don't think more than 1 in 100 or maybe 1 in 1,000 doctors would understand them, you then get a slight increase in relative. It seems to me an absurd way of proceeding. If it takes 60 million people to show that there's a 1.1 or 1.2 times risk of something, it really is pretty useless.
Exactly. So we do talk about that on this podcast, and we also talk about the fact that if a certain drug or supplement is studied with 2,400 different studies, we interpret that just as a generalization, that the company making that supplement had to do all those studies to get the study they needed to show that there was some benefit for their supplement.
Well, yeah. I hesitate to say that in some ways that things are getting better, but at least now companies aren't allowed to suppress trials of their substances that don't work. They have to publish them. And one of the problems, for example, with antidepressants was that their effect was grossly overestimated, because trials in which they failed to work or only worked marginally were simply not published, thus giving a misleading impression of the overall efficacy of the drug. And this is a fairly typical thing. Another very important difference, I'm sure you've talked about this before, is the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. You probably talked about that.
Not a lot, though, so I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, statistical significance just shows that a result is unlikely, not impossible, unlikely to have arisen by chance. So what you do is, for example, a scale, and you show that drug X has a statistically significant effect on the scoring on that scale. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has any difference from the patient's point of view. Absolutely no clinical significance whatsoever. And yet, at the end of the paper, it will be said that the drug had been shown to work. And this is quite a frequent, there was one paper, for example, which said that, which showed that a particular drug had reduced or had increased the length of time of relapse-free period in an illness, and it was by 2.8 months. But the illness, which was a fatal one, remained fatal, and it did not extend life expectancy of people suffering that illness. So this was of extremely limited value, at least from the point of view of a clinician. One has to remember, of course, that these drugs are very expensive, and they may have terrible side effects, which make life not worth living. And in fact, there was one paper where I saw that was obviously the case. So it's very important not just to read the summary, because the conclusions. They're often they're not false. They're misleading.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about this next week, but you might be stunned to find out that Coca-Cola. There was an examination recently of 87,000 pages of research documents. Coke's research contracts are now the big soda company to review. They determined that the research that has to do with Coke, they have the ability to review the data before it gets out, and they can kill any study at any time for any reason. So the one author that I'm reading, and we'll talk about this next week, it says, Coca-Cola is only interested in science when it can be manipulated to convince Americans to buy more of its products. Trusting them on nutrition science is like trusting Joe Camel to run a tobacco study. So they
surprise me.
Yeah, and they, like you say, read the fine print. Okay, see who funded the study. It's really important.
I mean, there are, of course, funded studies which find genuine things. So one can't just always impute the worst possible behavior to people, but you have to be skeptical. And in the case of Coca-Cola, I wouldn't drink it for reasons other than my health. But there you are. That's personal taste.
Well, we call it America's stealth weapon to get everybody sick and around the world.
Yeah.
So you bring up an interesting topic. In the is this the book that you wrote? Is it how big is it, and why should our listeners buy it?
Well,
false positive.
It's about 270 pages. What I've done is every week I took a paper or some commentary from the New England Journal and wrote an essay of about 1,400 words on that week's contents. And it varies. Some of it's about the social commentary of the New England Journal, which I'm afraid all tends to one kind of point of view. There's not much debate anyway in the pages. If you look for, it's a bit like reading Pravda. But But some was I took a paper. I was interested, for example, in the question of prostate cancer. I've reached the age at which that has some kind of practical interest for me, and again, I thought that the stuff was pretty poor on it.
Well, Dr. Dalrymple, I just got to ask you: has your invitations to speak at medical groups diminished since this book came out?
Well, I have very few anyway, so
I wonder why.
You cannot have less than 0 invitations. I have a previous experience of a kind of medical polemic, I suppose you would call it. I suggested that heroin addiction was not a genuine illness, and to treat it as if it were something that just happens to people, like Parkinson's disease just happens to people, is and is possibly false. And I provided, I think, fairly compelling reasons for believing this, but I'm afraid it was greeted with complete silence. So,
wow.
I expect complete silence. Silence is a very effective rhetorical tool.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just take 1 second, Jerry. We've been talking with Dr. Dalrymple. Dr. Dalrymple has consented to being on our program today, and he's calling in from Great Britain. So there's a occasional breakup in the audio, ladies and gentlemen. Just bear with us, and it clears right up. Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, basically, how does the average physician, protect himself, in trying to keep up with the literature, and he's confronted with this so-called prestigious journal, and after listening to you, he's better off reading a comic book.
Well, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say that, and I don't want to give the impression that nothing of any value is ever published in the New England Journal, far from that, or the Lancet, or any other such publication. So that it's not true that nothing is of value. I think someone pointed this out to me. Actually, it's not so much that people read or should read the journals and believe everything they read in it as if it were Holy Writ, which can be regarded as, but they talk amongst themselves and they talk about their experience and so on. And gradually things do sort themselves out eventually, the cost of the patients, but still, it does happen. So I think overall there is progress, but it's not just a straight upward slope. And I think it's extremely difficult for doctors, actually. As I said, I don't think many doctors read anything unless they are super specialists. Then they probably do have time to examine the literature of their very small area of interest more critically. But most doctors just don't have the time to, so they have to take a consensus view or take what's written in the journals. So it is very difficult.
Well, it's very interesting because Brian Peskin, who we've interviewed several times, makes the comment that the doctors are literally 20 years at minimum behind the actual research. So that's kind of a frightening commentary that the practicing doctors today are actually working, with antiquated technology.
It could be an advantage, of course, if the research is no good.
We never thought of that.
Right.
But I think
the latest is not necessarily the best.
I think that there is a downside to this that that I think is really important, and it's almost like a medical gate, because young physicians looking at these papers, in the United States, I don't know in Great Britain, but there's at least 106,000 deaths from appropriately prescribed medications. And there's a lot of these medications were given, like you mentioned antidepressants, but there's others were given the thumbs up in studies in the New England Journal, and the young physician doesn't know how to interpret those studies or doesn't read the conflicts of interest. I mean, it does have an effect on the population.
Yeah. Well, I think the most startling episode of this, to me anyway, and is the episode of opioid overdoses in the United States. And the history of that is, to me, extremely interesting. I don't know whether you want me to continue, whether we have time.
If you have the time, please do. Dr. Dalrymple?
Hello.
Did we lose him?
I think so.
He was called. Yeah, I don't hear him. He's I don't know. Let's see if he'll dial back in. Well, it's just an interesting that someone of his caliber and of his ability to write went ahead and put this in a book, because, as you said, he's not going to be too popular. And physicians, I hate to tell you, are trained to pay homage to these peer-reviewed, published studies. You just read you read the conclusion, or you read the abstract. That, well, yeah, I'm going to try that in the next patient I see. Well, there's lots of reasons not to do that. Okay.
Perfect example. I think I maybe mentioned in a previous show that we had an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which what we're discussing, and it was on a pharmaceutical grade fish oil, because a friend of mine who's a physician sent me the copy, and just like Dalrymple said, you just can't look at the conclusions. Well, but in the article itself, and I think I shared it with you, it specifically said that the people who took the refined pharmaceutical grade fish oil had a greater probability of winding up in a hospital with atrial fibrillation and bleeding problems versus the placebo group, which, puts a big doubt in my head. What kind of positive finding is that? And then on page 6 or 7, I think you pointed out to me that the advantage over preventing cardiovascular incidents with this, I call motor oil, this refined pharmaceutical grade fish oil, was 0.9% advantage.
Yeah, that was the absolute risk. Yeah, the absolute. Yeah. It was ridiculous. And at those huge doses they were giving them, and as we said, and Dr. Peskin, pointed out to us, that should not have come as a surprise. And there has been, I sent Professor Peskin 3 studies that were just reported in various medical journals here in the United States. Not one of them showed that these huge doses of what did he call them? Fish, antifreeze right. Fish for oil, had any benefit at all. And yours was even more recent.
Yeah. Well, the joke of the whole thing is, I believe there was a conflict of interest, because they were naming a product in there that they're basically trying to promote to sell the darn thing. So to me, that was a conflict of interest, and people or doctors get a full sense of security, from that nonsense.
Absolutely. So, and again, it goes to one of the premises of this program is take control of your own body. And listen to this show. Dr. Dalrymple, I think he just got back on. Let me see if that's him.
Yeah.
You did it.
Sorry about that.
No
we
problem.
Thought it was MI5 that canceled you.
We probably, the NSA and CIA listen to programs like this who you don't know our program, where we do preach a lot of alternative medicine, so we're due to get hit.
Yeah.
So you were going to talk about the opioids, and I'd be interested to hear what your opinions on that.
Well, in 1980, there was a letter in the New England Journal by people called Porter and Jick, who said that very few opioid addicts came out of hospital having treated with morphine or strong opiates for acute, for example, heart attack or something like that. They didn't become addicts when they're treated in hospital for those conditions, which was perfectly true. And in those days, there was a reluctance of doctors to give opiates, even people who would have benefited from them, because they were so afraid that they would become addicts. And they would even deny sometimes to dying patients because they might become addicts before they died. And that was perfectly correct. And then years later, this direct observation was used to insinuate that patients with, shall we say, low back pain or other less specific causes of pain could be prescribed opioids or opiates with it because they wouldn't become addicted. As we know, that was true. And actually, I would have thought that a doctor with a experience should have known that it wasn't true. But now, of course, we have, or in the United States, there are millions of addicts. And the total number of deaths from overdoses of these drugs exceeds all military deaths, military deaths, since the end of the Second World War. In fact, it's more than twice as many. So it is a bit of a disaster. And it stems, I think, from a wrong reading of a very small article in the New England Journal. And this shows how misinterpretation can have disastrous effects. I think now, of course, the epidemic is so great that it's escaped kind of medical control. But here is a very startling example of how misinterpretation or misunderstanding can lead to disaster.
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of discussion on the opioids, except for the fact that it happened, and that my personal opinion is that the doctors themselves, along with help from the drug companies, created this epidemic. Because I'm also retired here in South Florida, and I do have a hobby of golfing, and I can't tell you the number of people I golf with that go in for an arthroscopic knee surgery and come out with 30 OxyContin tablets and 20 Percodans, and just really uncalled for, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, they can sell them on eBay, you know.
Well, I mean, the doctors have done that. Some doctors, I think, were corrupt, of course. I dare say in some places they prescribe because they're afraid of their patients. Certainly that's true in England.
I take it a step further. It's just easier for them to give them a prescription and not have them call them at all hours. It's just easier to sedate them with the opioid than to really be a physician. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Dalrymple, wouldn't the National Health Service monitor opioid prescriptions more carefully, and I guess maybe sanction doctors if they're beyond this, a reasonable limit?
I think it does. Yes, I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't gone so far, and I hope it doesn't go so far. I mean, I hope doctors not only in Britain as in Europe learn from the American experience. However, my view of pain clinics, I mean, I saw it myself, was that they were very liberal prescribers, despite the fact that there was very little evidence that prescribing these drugs did people much good. And since they are potentially very harmful, it seemed to me that they should not have been prescribed as liberally as they were. Unfortunately, now I think it's got beyond the control, I said, of doctors, because things like drugs like fentanyl are coming in illegally from China and other places. So even if doctors were now to start being more careful with prescriptions, it's probably it might be too late. It's not a reason not to be careful, of course, but as it were, the genie is out of the bottle.
Well, what's very interesting, there are, alternatives in treating, chronic pain. I recently integrated Qigong acupuncture into my practice, and recently had a patient who had 38 years of chronic pain from a car accident where he hit his head on the windshield, and doing a cranial manipulation and then Qigong acupuncture, the pain was totally gone. So unfortunately, the average physician is not skilled or aware of these alternative therapies that can alleviate pain non-invasively.
Yes, of course you'd have to study them scientifically as well to show that they work. But anyway, I mean, what one can say is, what I think one can say without much fear of contradiction, is that the drugs that have been given have not done much good, to put it very mildly. Although I must say that when I've expressed this view on the internet and so on, and you always get people saying you're an unfeeling monster. I want my drugs. Mm-hmm. And anyway, the other thing that I think was very striking was the slowness of the response to this situation in America. I think I've been banging on about it for some time, but the response to what was clearly happening was very slow and very, very muted. Nobody took any notice of it until fairly recently, I would say, even though it's been developing since just before the year 2000.
Well, do you think the fact that it's generating a lot of income is a reason for the slowness?
I'm a bit hesitant to ascribe the worst motives to people. I mean, I'm sure that was true for some, but it wouldn't explain it all. Part of it, of course, was probably because the doctors who didn't do it weren't really interested in what other people were doing. So, I mean, it's not that every doctor in the United States has behaved like this.
Well, I think when it comes to drugs, anyway, the medical literature is suspect and it's unreliable. And I think our young physicians who now are trained in our schools here in the United States, where 78% of the board of directors are big pharmaceutical executives, I think they really have to have a second education and how to read journals and how to think critically. And I don't think our young doctors have the ability to have any critical thinking like an engineer would, or someone trained in that field.
Yes, well, I mean, there's an obvious solution. That's that they should read my book, or at least buy it.
Well, why don't we tell them about this book again? It's called False
Where
Positive.
Can they get it? Yeah.
Amazon, of course.
Yeah, it's called False Positive: A Year of Error, Omission, and Political Correctness in the New England Journal of Medicine. It is the publisher is Encounter Books, and of course Amazon has it. I'm going to get a copy. I'm going to recommend to our listeners that they get a copy. And if you know anyone that's going into a medical school or even a veterinary school or any of the natural sciences, it would be a good gift for them.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I didn't think I'd get anything negative about that. So, Dr.
One of the other
Dalrymple,
problems, Dr. Dalrymple, is the physicians are not trained to really see the underlying problem of the pain. I just had a young woman in today. For 2 years, she's been running around to doctors and spend, probably over $25,000 looking for solutions in pain. And she had fallen 2 years ago while walking her sister's dog and hit her chin on the pavement, and she had excruciating, trigeminal path pain. Long story short, I adjusted her cranium and the pain totally disappeared. I mean, the woman was crying. She couldn't believe that she spent 2 years in agonizing pain and no one had any clue why it happened. So I think the problem today is that there's no digging lateral holes, meaning they're not understanding craniopathy, osteopathy, nutrition, to look at the problem from a different perspective as opposed to just treating the symptom.
Well, I think one of the problems, well, there are two problems. One is that doctors have very little time, so you often don't have much time to with patients. In Britain, I think the average consultation time for a general practitioner, for a family doctor, is between 6 and 8 minutes.
Wow.
And he's got
you can't even get a prayer in 6 and 8 minutes.
Well, you can see a lot of stuff on a computer in 6 or 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Most of them just look at the computer most of the time. But also, of course, they're increasingly protocol driven, so that they are told what to do. When X occurs, you must do Y, and if that doesn't work, you must start again and start with A and then B. So actually, thinking deeply is not about patients is not encouraged in such a situation.
Well, Dr. Dalrymple, I really appreciate you coming on today. I hope we would have a follow-up interview in 6 months or so when we see the feedback from your book and see if you can survive the onslaught. See how your social life is going.
Yeah, and do they sell Kevlar vests over in the UK? Well, they don't carry guns over there, do they?
No, I'm in France at the moment.
Okay.
I'm calling you from France. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I think we gave our audience an idea of what to expect from your book on Amazon. It's published under Dr. Dalrymple, Dalrymple. And Dr. Dalrymple, I often tell the story that my parents moved 13 times when I was a child, and I found them every time. And I find that you publish under a lot of different names, so I have to be careful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. Dr. Jerry, any final questions for Doctor?
Well, I always tell patients to never trust a doctor who has dying plants in the reception room.
Yeah.
Well, I think our audience, what we do here on Dr. Ron Unfiltered, Uncensored, is try and have people think critically and evaluate and get other opinions, and don't, just because a doctor is up sitting on his high horse with a lot of published papers, don't just take that for granted. And I think works like yours and other podcasts like ours can make our audience and people think, and if they think, I think they'll have a better outcome with their health.
Yeah, and another, I think, little pearl is we had a compounding pharmacist on several times, and basically as a patient, if you don't understand the medications you're being prescribed, if you have access to a compounding pharmacist, they could, sit down with you and sort it out to see if what was prescribed is really going to be to your benefit. So you really have to be the CEO of your own health, as Dr. Ron always says, and be proactive instead of just being a sheeple and being led to slaughter.
Yes. Well, I hope I haven't done that in my career.
Well, Dr. Dalrymple, thank you so much for taking the time. Enjoy the beautiful French countryside. I hope you're in the countryside.
I'm in Paris, actually.
Oh, you're in Paris. Oh, my gosh.
And it's terribly hot. It's very hot. So it's been 100 degrees.
Oh, my gosh. Wow, that is hot.
Yeah,
I hope you have air conditioning.
You have good wine there to ease the pain.
Yes. Well, it's better than opioids.
Right.
Well, okay. Thank you so much, Doctor, and we hope to have you on again, and we will promote this program, promote your book. We believe in what in the premise of your book, and we hope to have you on again. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, enjoy. So that, ladies and gentlemen, we had been talking to Dr. Dalrymple. He is a retired physician who wrote a book about the New England Journal of Medicine, and we have talked about about journal articles and how there's a lot of them are paid for. So he's put it down in black and white, and we'll see if he pays the price for that. And this was just an extra program that Dr. Jerry and I brought to you today because we felt that this information is really critical for you too. And just so you know, we are on Castbox now. What is that? That is an app that integrates with Waze, the GPS application. And if you're driving along and you don't have to make a lot of turns, you can actually listen to our episodes of Dr. Ron Unfiltered, Uncensored with this Castbox addition to Waze. So besides being on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Google Play and iHeartRadio and TuneIn Radio and a host of other apps that you can play in your car, and now we are integrated with Waze. So, Dr. Jerry, I think we accomplished what we wanted to do today. So I think we can just call it a day and see what we're going to do for next week. It depends, of course. Dr. Jerry's he's good with anything, but yours truly is just about moving.
Well, you're the guy that's under the gun, so it all depends on your situation.
Exactly, but you always rise to the occasion, so I thank you for that. I was thinking if I have time next week or next Tuesday at our regular scheduled time, we could talk about dementia again, because we haven't talked about it, and we haven't talked about how certain drugs can really jack you up and make you have dementia, and it could be curable. And I want to maybe we'll get Dr. Dr. Wong on too, because we've been going back and forth about pot use, and he agrees with me that heavy pot use can cause brain damage. It gets into the meninges of the brain and actually stains them brown, and that brown never goes away. And there's articles coming out now where regular cannabis use can alter the brain region tied to cognitive control. So we'll talk a little bit about dementia and cognition next week, but you're going to have to stay tuned and see if we can fit that show in. So, Dr. Jerry, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It was fun. Always learned something, and more importantly, is our patients or our listening audience, rather, wake up to the broken medical system that they're being confronted with. So that's the key point.
Well put. And with that thought, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you on the radio Tuesday at 7. Have a great night. Ciao. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to Dr. Ron, Unfiltered, Uncensored, with Dr. Ron and Dr. Jerry. We are here each and every week to bring you medical news that you can use and medical news that you will not hear on the mainstream media. We hope you enjoy our podcast, and we hope to see you on the radio next week. Have a great one. Ciao.